It started with a fire truck swerving onto my lawn. Not because it was out of control or lost, but because the driver had to dodge a brand new no parking sign Karen from the HOA had installed 2 feet into the road. Sirens blaring, brakes squealing, and the back tire kicking up turf like a charging bull, it carved a trench through my yard and rolled right past my emergency water tank. The firefighters jumped out, screaming for connection access. That's when I saw her. Karen. Bathrobe, sunglasses, mimosa in hand. She pointed at the tank and shrieked, "That thing is violating community aesthetics." It didn't matter that the fire truck had just tapped into it. It didn't matter that the backup water system had just saved Station 14 from a pressure failure. Karen had already filed the removal order. I built that tank to save lives. Karen wanted it gone because it clashed with her flower pot. 3 days before that moment, I'd been working under the morning sun, doing a final inspection of the pressure gauges on my side-mounted tank valve. I'd done this routine dozens of times. Check the seals. Test the flow. Document the psi levels. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary, until I looked up and saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, hands on hips, lips pursed like she was about to chew glass. She didn't even say good morning. Just launched right into it. "What is that thing supposed to be?" she demanded, jabbing her finger at the tank like it had personally insulted her HOA status. "Emergency water reservoir," I replied, not bothering to climb down from the ladder. "For backup. In case the municipal line ever fails." "You can't just install a silo in a residential zone," she snapped. "It's an eyesore. And it's too shiny. It's powder-coated to resist UV degradation." Karen blinked like I'd spoken Klingon. Then she narrowed her eyes and took out her phone. I knew the dance. She was either going to call the HOA board or summon a building inspector who owed her a favor from her days running the local yoga studio. Karen had a gift for turning minor annoyances into formal violations, and a passion for bylaws so intense you'd think she was interpreting the Constitution. By the next morning, I had 3 citations tucked under my door. One claimed the tank exceeded height regulations, another said it had a reflective surface creating a visual nuisance, and the third accused me of non-conforming agricultural equipment. That one made me laugh. I wasn't raising corn. I was housing pressurized water for firefighting contingencies. But Karen didn't care about facts. She cared about appearances, and that tank had committed the ultimate sin, being visible. What Karen didn't know, and what I never told anyone in the neighborhood unless absolutely necessary, was that I wasn't just some handy homeowner with a big silver drum. I worked under a silent contract with the county's Emergency Preparedness Division. After the fire 5 years ago that left 3 blocks of our area without hydrant access due to pressure loss, the fire department commissioned a series of decentralized backup tanks. Mine was the prototype, designed, installed, and tested to meet wildland-urban interface scenarios. The water wasn't just mine. It belonged to the fire grid. And Karen was threatening to rip it out because she thought it made her patio parties look less charming. It didn't take long for the drama to spread. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting, which meant she brought folding chairs to her driveway and sent a mass text using the community app. 5 people showed up, 3 of whom were just there for the wine she'd promised. Still, she stood on a cooler and declared the tank a threat to the community's real estate value, citing made-up statistics about lowered home prices near unsightly utility structures. She passed around a petition and waved it like a legal document. I watched from across the street as she rallied the kind of energy most people reserve for political revolutions or sports riot. That evening, I got a visit from Steve, the building compliance guy. He had a clipboard, a sympathetic look, and a nervous shuffle. "I don't want trouble," he said, scratching his head as he examined the tank, "but we got a complaint and I've got to do the paperwork." "She filed under zoning violation?" "Yup. I've got federal documentation and a classified use clause." He raised his eyebrows, then glanced back at the tank like it had just become a military installation. "You serious?" "As a wildfire in July," I said. "And if she keeps pushing, she's going to find out what happens when you interfere with federal infrastructure." Steve looked ready to bolt. He scribbled something on his pad and promised to escalate it to legal. I knew what that meant. Red tape, delays, a dozen phone calls to people who had no idea this project existed because it was designed that way. Karen had unknowingly picked a fight not just with a tank, but with a system meant to stay invisible until disaster struck. By the following weekend, things had gone from petty to absurd. Someone, probably Karen, put up a sign next to the tank that read, "This property devalues yours." A couple of her followers began parking in front of my driveway in protest, taking selfies and captioning them with phrases like, "Defending beauty, one tank at a time." A teenager even brought spray paint and tagged the tank with the word "drained." I had it cleaned in under an hour, but it made me furious. Not because of the vandalism, but because they didn't even understand what they were attacking. They thought it was about appearances. They had no idea what this thing was really for. Then came the moment that would flip everything on its head. The day the fire broke out, the municipal lines began to choke almost immediately. The heat wave had pushed the system to its limits, and within 20 minutes, pressure dropped dangerously low in our quadrant. Station 14 initiated emergency backup protocol. That meant one thing, my tank. The fire truck came barreling down the street, sirens splitting the air, tires burning rubber. And that's when it swerved onto my lawn. They knew the GPS coordinates by heart. As the crew leapt out and connected the pumper to my valve, I could hear the hiss and roar of water pressurizing through the system. And then, like she was summoned by the chaos, Karen appeared. Not to help. Not to move the HOA gate or offer water to the firefighters, but to shout about her property lines and how this entire operation was unauthorized. She tried to argue with the fire captain, claiming I'd illegally installed a water bomb. She actually used the words, "domestic threat." The firefighters ignored her, and as the pump roared to life and jets of water blasted toward the advancing flames, I realized just how deep Karen had dug herself. She hadn't just tried to remove a water tank. She had interfered with the one piece of infrastructure that could mean life or death for this entire block. And she still had no idea. The morning after the fire drill turned real disaster, my property looked like a battleground. Tire marks carved into my lawn from the fire truck, scorched edges on the flower beds, and black soot staining the front corner of the water tank where the flames had nearly licked it. Despite all that, the system had worked exactly as designed. The tank had delivered thousands of gallons of emergency water in under 15 minutes, stabilizing pressure and giving Station 14 the edge they needed. Homes had been saved, lives possibly too. But none of that mattered to Karen. Not to someone who believed control was more important than fact. Her response? She doubled down. The very next morning, I woke to an HOA newsletter that had been stuffed in every mailbox and taped to light poles. The headline read, "Unauthorized military tank nearly causes firestorm in our community." It was written like an op-ed from someone who had watched too many conspiracy thrillers. Karen accused me of installing industrial hardware on private property without civilian oversight, claimed my tank had attracted danger, and concluded by warning neighbors that further unauthorized structures may be lurking in your midst. She'd even included a grainy photo of the fire truck hosing down a blaze, trying to frame it as a problem instead of the solution. The image had a bright red circle drawn around the tank, as if it were evidence from a crime scene. I thought about ignoring it. I really did. But then the building inspector showed up again, this time with a more formal notice. Apparently, Karen had escalated her complaint to the HOA's legal committee and filed a formal challenge with the zoning department. She was pushing for a cease and desist on all water pumping from my tank. That would have been laughable, except now there was bureaucratic machinery spinning in motion. The system that was supposed to protect people was now tangled up trying to dismantle the very tool that had saved them. While I fielded calls from bewildered city officials, Karen had begun personally walking the neighborhood with a printed petition. It was as if the fire had only fueled her mission. Wearing a sun hat and holding a clipboard like a scout leader on a warpath, she knocked on doors and warned people that I was piping in chemicals from unknown sources and running unauthorized experiments. Her version of the story kept changing depending on who she spoke to. Some residents were swayed, others just humored her. But all it took was a few scared voices to spark panic. One elderly couple actually called the EPA. Another asked me if their pets were safe. It was maddening. I decided it was time to push back, not with angry words but with clarity. I contacted the county fire marshal, who agreed to meet me on site. Captain Ramirez had signed off on the tank years ago and had always supported the backup grid program. When he arrived in uniform and stepped out of his SUV, it was the first time I saw Karen actually look nervous. She tried to intercept him at the curb, waving her stack of papers like they were arrest warrant. "I've submitted multiple complaints," she began. "You should know this structure violates Section 12.4 of our neighborhood design standards. It's registered under Emergency Protocol and backed by County Ordinance 491C, he said, not even stopping to let her finish. "We signed this install off 4 years ago." Karen blinked like someone had short-circuited her brain. She stammered something about public hearings, but Ramirez walked right past her and joined me near the tank. "She's going to keep pushing, huh?" he muttered under his breath. "Harder than gravity," I said. He chuckled, but the humor faded fast. "Listen, we've got your back, but the zoning board's getting pressure from above. You need to get your documentation in order, fast. We can testify, but if it gets tied up in legal ambiguity, they might freeze your use of the tank." I nodded grimly. I already knew what I had to do. The permits, while valid, were buried under classified city paperwork that wasn't easily accessible to the average bureaucrat. I'd need to bring in the original contract, the emergency use waiver, the authorization from Station 14, and the water testing records, all within the next week, before the zoning hearing. And of course, Karen had scheduled the HOA vote just 2 days before that, hoping to declare the tank a neighborhood nuisance and demand a shutdown by majority vote. The idea of defending life-saving infrastructure in front of a suburban mob with wine glasses and lawn chairs made me want to slam my head into a brick wall. But I had no choice. The next few days turned into a whirlwind. I dug through my archives, called up engineers, forwarded emails, requested official statements. Meanwhile, Karen began escalating her rhetoric. She posted to neighborhood forums, hosted live streams where she showed off images of rust on the tank, which was actually dirt from the fire, and even brought in a local blogger to write a hit piece titled, "The Tank Terror in Our Backyard." One night I returned home to find someone had thrown eggs at the tank. Another morning, someone had tied a fake, hazardous materials sign to the fence. I installed cameras after that. The final straw was when I caught a teenager, probably influenced by Karen's fearmongering, trying to open one of the valve cabinet. He had no idea what he was doing and could have flooded the whole system or triggered a safety lockdown. I caught him just in time and sent him running with a warning, but I made sure to save the footage. That video would come in handy later. Despite all the chaos, I stayed focused. The night before the HOA vote, I finalized my packet. It was thick, heavy, and filled with every legal form, engineering spec, water analysis, and government signature I could find. If they wanted a fight, I was ready. But Karen wasn't finished playing games. At the HOA vote, she brought a guest speaker, a supposed urban environmental consultant, who claimed the tank could leach metals into the soil and proposed that the neighborhood opt for eco-friendly fire safety alternatives. He never defined what that meant. Karen nodded furiously throughout his speech, clapping loudly at the end as if she'd just witnessed the Gettysburg Address. I waited until she opened the floor, then walked up with my folder and placed it on the table like a brick of truth. "I'll make this simple," I said. "This tank is registered as emergency infrastructure. It was activated during the last fire and saved homes. You want to vote it out, you'd better be ready to explain why you knowingly dismantled a system designed to keep you alive." I slid the letter from Captain Ramirez across the table. Then the signed county approval. Then the FEMA co-op contract. As the stack grew, Karen's face paled. Her consultant quietly got up and walked out. The room, once buzzing with whispers, went silent. I could see minds changing right then and there. People started to murmur about how the tank had worked, about how they remembered the hose trucks using it. A few began shaking their heads, embarrassed they'd bought into Karen's circus. But I also knew she wasn't done. Not yet. She stood, straightened her HOA badge like it was armor, and declared that the vote would proceed anyway, because optics matter. Her words. Not safety. Not logic. Optics. The vote was split. Not enough to order removal, but not enough to fully shut down the issue. The tie meant it would be passed to the city council, and from there, to zoning. Karen smiled like she'd won something. But I wasn't worried, because when it came to the next step, she'd be facing more than homeowners with petitions. She'd be facing sworn testimony, signed contracts, and a very angry fire chief who was already preparing his statement. She thought this was about a tank. She had no idea it was about to become a war. 3 days after the HOA vote deadlocked, the weather turned vicious. Bone-dry winds whipped through the valley, and by noon, the heat shimmered off rooftops like a mirage. Local alerts began pinging phones about extreme fire conditions, and the air had that electric tension that comes just before disaster strikes. I had already run a precautionary check on the tank, ensuring pressure was stable, valves were tight, and backup access keys were secured in the hidden lockbox. I even rerouted one of the emergency hoses to make it easier for Station 14 to connect if things went sideways. What I didn't count on was Karen escalating her madness in the middle of a crisis. While I was adjusting the pump calibration, I saw her on the sidewalk pacing with her phone glued to her ear. She wasn't panicking like a normal person preparing for a fire threat. She was grinning, laughing even. She kept saying things like, "It's about time they acted," and well, the truck should be there any minute. I didn't like the sound of that one bit. When I asked her directly if something was going on, she gave me a smug shrug and said, "You should have followed the rules, sweetheart." Then she walked off like a villain in a bad soap opera. 20 minutes later, a tow truck rolled up in front of my property. At first I thought it was for someone else. The driver hopped out with a clipboard and made his way to the side yard, where the tank sat gleaming in the sun like a sentinel. I intercepted him just before he touched the gate. "Can I help you?" I asked, already clenching my jaw. "Got an order here for unauthorized utility removal," he said. "Address matches. They said the HOA approved it." "They lied," I said flatly. "That tank is part of a county emergency backup system. You touch it, you're interfering with public safety infrastructure." He paused. "I just drive the truck, man." I handed him the letter from the fire marshal and pointed at the placard bolted to the tank, one that clearly listed its emergency designation and FEMA code. He read it twice, then slowly stepped back. "Yeah, I'm not messing with that," he muttered before walking back to his cab. Karen, watching from across the street, started shouting, "Why are you leaving? This isn't done." He waved her off. "You got a problem, take it to the city. I'm not getting sued." As the tow truck rumbled away, Karen marched over like she owned the asphalt. "You're delaying the inevitable," she hissed. "That tank is coming out. You think you're above the rules, but the city's on my side now." "The city's about to be on fire," I said. "And that tank may be the only thing that saves this block again." She scoffed. Drama queen. That afternoon, smoke bloomed on the horizon. Not a drill. Not a test. A real wildfire, pushed by wind and sparked by downed wires near the foothills. Alerts went from yellow to red in minute. People began evacuating neighborhoods across the ridge. Fire engines screamed through intersections, and the air filled with the scent of burning pine. I opened my garage and started prepping the exterior of my property, spraying down dry brush and setting out boundary markers in case responders needed to access the tank. Then the real insanity began. Karen locked the gate. It sounds impossible, but it happened. The HOA-owned gate at the end of our street, normally left open for public access, was padlocked shut. A freshly printed sign had been zip-tied to the bars. No through traffic. Private road. HOA authorization required. I stood there in disbelief. Fire trucks couldn't even enter. I called the station. Captain Ramirez answered immediately, already en route. "We've got limited pressure on your side," he said. "We're activating the tank. We'll be there in 5. "You can't get through," I said. Karen padlocked the gate. "Say that again?" She literally locked the main access point to the backup supply. There was a pause. Then, "We're coming in hot. Be ready." I ran back to the tank and prepared for manual override. Moments later, I heard the rumble, 2 engines barreling toward us, forced to stop short at the gate. Firefighters leapt out, one of them clipping the padlock with bolt cutters in seconds. Karen came running down the street in a panic, screaming at them to stop. "This is private property. You can't be here. I have authority." One of the firefighters, soaked in sweat and ash, turned and shouted, "We have flames licking a school perimeter less than a mile from here, lady. Get out of the way." She froze, stunned into silence for once. The trucks rolled past her and onto my property, tires once again tearing through my lawn. I threw open the secondary valve access, and they connected the pumps without missing a beat. Water gushed through the hoses, feeding directly into the main engine and out toward containment lines set up near the ridge. The heat, the smoke, the roar of the pump, it was chaotic and terrifying and deeply satisfying all at once, because even as the fire raged, the tank stood strong, doing its job. Not arguing, not whining about bylaws. Just working. Neighbors started gathering on the sidewalk. Phones were out. People were filming. And in the middle of it all stood Karen, watching her carefully curated facade unravel. She tried once more to claim the tank was illegal, only for one of the fire crew to cut her off with a curt "Ma'am, you almost got people killed today." That shut her up. After the fire was contained, Captain Ramirez approached me with soot-streaked cheeks and tired eyes. "She tried to stop us from accessing life-saving water," he said. "She doesn't get to walk away from that." "I've got footage of her locking the gate," I told him, "and a full record of her trying to have the tank removed 3 times. His jaw tightened. "Send it to me. And send it to the city council. This isn't HOA drama anymore. This is obstruction of emergency response." As the firefighters packed up and left, neighbors crossed the street to thank me. Some were quiet, embarrassed they had ever signed Karen's petition. Others were more vocal, saying they'd call for a special meeting to reconsider everything. A few even offered to help repair the damage to my lawn and repaint the tank's lower panels where soot had stained them. Karen? She slinked back into her house like a shadow, slamming the door behind her. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because while the fire had been extinguished, the real flames, political, legal, and public, were only beginning to spread. The news vans rolled into the neighborhood around dusk. Someone had tipped off the local station, and they wanted an interview. They asked for a hero. I just pointed to the tank. "This thing saved your homes," I said. "And someone tried to remove it because it didn't look pretty." That's the story. By the time the 10 o'clock news aired, the footage was already viral. The padlocked gate. The tank saving the day. The angry woman screaming about aesthetics while firefighters battled an actual blaze behind her. Karen had picked the wrong enemy. And the wrong emergency to interfere with. The next morning, my driveway was littered with reporters. Some local, some from nearby cities, a few even from statewide networks. Word had spread fast. The video of Karen shouting at firefighters and locking the gate had gone viral overnight. It had all the elements the media loved: danger, stupidity, HOA politics, and a dramatic save by a piece of equipment that looked like it belonged in a farm supply yard. It wasn't just a story anymore, it had become a symbol. People were already calling it the tank that saved Timber Ridge, and I was being treated like I'd personally fought the fire with a garden hose and grit. It would have been funny if it weren't so surreal. I hadn't set out to be a hero. I just followed the safety protocols I helped write. But Karen didn't see it that way. Not even now. By noon, she held her own press conference, dragging a portable podium into her front yard and dressing like she was campaigning for city council. She wore a blue blazer, full makeup, and stood in front of a freshly hung HOA banner. About a dozen residents stood behind her, clearly bribed with muffins or guilt. She started speaking into a megaphone even though nobody asked her to, launching into a rambling defense about miscommunication, overreach, and concerns about water stability. She tried to spin it like she was protecting the neighborhood from structural failure. She even held up a fake schematic that showed the tank leaking into underground cables. It was a crude drawing, probably done on PowerPoint, and it had zero basis in engineering reality. Then she made the ultimate mistake. She claimed that firefighters had misused emergency equipment and overstepped their authority. It was an attack not just on me, but on the fire department that had just saved dozens of homes. 15 minutes later, Captain Ramirez held a counter-press conference. No podium, no muffins, just him, in uniform, standing in front of the scorched ridge and calmly explaining the truth. He showed the real blueprints, walked the crowd through the backup system, and then dropped the bomb. Karen's gate lock and her attempts to remove the tank had directly impeded emergency response. There were now formal complaints filed with the city, the county, and even the state's Office of Emergency Services. Karen had gone from HOA queen to public hazard in under 24 hours. The fallout hit fast. City inspectors showed up that afternoon with clipboards and caution tape. They examined the gate, the chain, the lock, even the cement post she'd planted months ago to control neighborhood traffic. It turns out none of it had been approved through the city. All illegal. And suddenly, the same people who used to nod politely at her every command were pretending not to know her. Karen tried to fight back. She posted a 1,200-word essay on the community forum titled, "Why I Took a Stand." It was full of half-truths, vague warnings about liability, and some bizarre metaphor about how tanks invite militarization. But the damage was done. Neighbors had watched the fire themselves. They had seen the trucks blocked by her lock. They had felt the fear. One family had packed their car ready to evacuate. Another had used their garden hose to keep embers off the roof. They knew exactly who had helped them and who had nearly doomed them. No amount of muffins or blog posts could fix that. At the next emergency HOA meeting, which Karen still tried to chair despite calls for her resignation, the mood was volcanic. The usually polite and mild-mannered crowd came in hot. One man shouted about how his son had asthma and couldn't breathe during the fire. Another woman cried while describing how close her fence came to catching. A retired veteran stood up and said he hadn't fought for his country just to be told by some suburban tyrant that his street didn't need emergency access. Karen tried to maintain control. She tapped her gavel, asked for decorum, and then blamed me for failing to communicate the true nature of the tank. That was the final straw. I stood and calmly read from my permit packet. I showed her signature on the original neighborhood awareness form. I reminded everyone that I'd hosted a safety walkthrough 3 years ago and invited the entire block. Half the people in the room had attended. Karen had RSVP'd but never shown. Her excuse at the time? She had a brunch. The vote to suspend her presidency was unanimous. Even her usual allies turned their cards over without hesitation. Her face was blank. She didn't even argue. Just stood, adjusted her chair, and walked out without saying a word. But I knew that wouldn't be the end of it. People like Karen don't melt away. They simmer, plot, wait for another opportunity to reassert control. The problem was, this time she'd gone too far, and it was no longer just HOA business. Within days, she received formal notification from the city about pending charges for obstruction of emergency personnel. A misdemeanor, possibly more depending on how the investigation panned out. She tried to play the victim, claiming she was being targeted because she was a woman in leadership. But nobody was buying it anymore. Not after the video, not after the fire, not after the lock. Meanwhile, the tank got a makeover. A few neighborhood kids volunteered to repaint it. This time with a mural showing a fire truck, a garden, and the words, "Timber Ridge Emergency Water," across the side. The city offered to pay for a plaque commemorating its use in the fire response. It would be the first time in county history that a privately owned, federally supported water tank was designated as a public safety landmark. I didn't want the attention, but I wasn't going to reject it either. Let the tank have its glory. It earned it. One of the biggest surprises came from the mayor's office. A staffer called me and asked if I'd consider consulting on backup grid infrastructure. Apparently, the video had triggered a wave of calls from other neighborhoods worried about their own emergency readiness. It was surreal. I'd built that tank with zero expectation of praise, yet now it was sparking a whole conversation across the county. Karen, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. Her house sat quiet, blinds drawn. Rumor was she'd gone to stay with a cousin in another district while the legal situation blew over. Her name disappeared from HOA documents within the week, and as new leadership stepped in, they rewrote several bylaws to prevent anything like this from happening again. Emergency infrastructure would no longer be subject to aesthetic regulations. Utility systems could not be petitioned for removal by residents. And most importantly, any action that blocked emergency responders would result in immediate suspension from HOA participation. Life settled down. People walked by the tank and smiled instead of scowling. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now waved. Kids rode scooters down the sidewalk that had once been patrolled by Karen like a border checkpoint. The air felt different, freer, lighter, as if the smoke from the fire had carried her entire reign away with it. But I kept the lockbox secured, just in case, because while the flames were out and the tank stood strong, the lesson remained. In every neighborhood, there's always someone ready to twist power into a weapon. And all it takes to stop them is a system that works, a backbone that doesn't bend, and the truth. Pressurized and ready like a tank waiting to save the day. The neighborhood never quite went back to normal, but that wasn't a bad thing. In fact, it changed for the better. Timber Ridge had always been a pristine, well-manicured community, the kind with weekly lawn awards and passive-aggressive newsletter notes about trash bin etiquette. But the fire, the tank, and most of all, the fall of Karen, had peeled back that perfectly mowed surface and forced people to deal with something real. There was a strange solidarity now, a kind of respect that didn't exist before. The kind that grows not from social clubs or block parties, but from knowing who stood up when it mattered. The plaque unveiling was held on a crisp Saturday morning, with kids waving little paper fire hoses and the local station parked on the street like honored guests. Captain Ramirez gave a short, sincere speech about community resilience and how, sometimes the quietest people do the loudest things when the time comes. I didn't make a speech. I just stood beside the tank while the tarp was pulled down, revealing a steel sign that read, "This tank saved Timber Ridge on August 17, 2:36 p.m. May it always stand ready." There was a moment of silence, not solemn but reverent, as if the crowd was acknowledging not just the tank, but everything that had led to that moment. After the ceremony, I was approached by a man in a suit with a city emblem on his lapel. He introduced himself as Nolan from the County Infrastructure Office. He told me my name had come up repeatedly in meetings about regional emergency planning. He asked if I'd be willing to consult on other decentralized safety solutions, Maybe even draft some protocols for new suburban development. I didn't say yes immediately, but I didn't say no either. A few weeks ago, I'd just been a guy with a tank in his yard. Now I was apparently someone worth listening to. Back at home that evening, as I cleaned soot-stained residue from the pump base, I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything. It still didn't feel real. The smoke in the distance, the locked gate, the look in the firefighter's eyes when he realized they might be too late. And then the hiss and roar of the tank doing what it was designed to do. It haunted me, not because it had gone wrong, but because it had almost been prevented from happening at all. That was the part that stuck with me. It wasn't the fire that nearly destroyed us. It was ignorance, ego, and bureaucracy wrapped in a pastel cardigan with HOA pins. Karen had gone quiet for weeks, her house shrouded in silence, her porch devoid of its usual rotating arrangement of planters. Some people said she'd moved in with family across town. Others believed she was still inside, hiding from the public like a dethroned monarch too proud to show her face. The city council had formally reprimanded her. Though not jailed, she was fined for obstruction and barred from any future position in a registered homeowners association. That part was especially poetic, banned from the very title she once flaunted like a crown. But as expected, Karen didn't disappear forever. On the third Sunday after the fire, she re-emerged. She appeared at the local farmers' market of all places, standing near a booth selling organic honey. I spotted her from across the path, and for a second, I thought maybe she was just trying to start fresh, quietly rejoin the world. But then I saw it, the way she subtly gestured to a small cluster of people, nodding at something behind her. She was pointing at the fire station's safety display, where a poster of my tank stood tall beside the disaster readiness banner. Later that day, I heard from a neighbor that Karen was telling people the tank was still under investigation, that it had questionable design origins, and was part of a government overreach. She even implied that I had used public money to build it for personal gain. It was a laughable theory, but this was Karen. She didn't need truth, just someone willing to listen. Luckily, this time nobody cared. The neighborhood had seen too much. They remembered what it was like to watch the flames. They remembered who had helped and who had hindered. And so her new smear campaign went nowhere. She was a relic now, her relevance reduced to whispered jokes and dismissive shrugs. The new HOA president, Mark, was a retired paramedic with a bald head, booming laugh, and zero tolerance for nonsense. He invited me to join the new Emergency Preparedness Committee, which he launched with a public barbecue and first aid demo instead of the usual clipboard parade. He didn't care about lawn colors or shutter styles. He cared about function, safety, and keeping people alive. It was refreshing. For the first time in years, people started waving when they passed my house. Kids on bikes would stop and ask about the tank, and I found myself giving impromptu science lessons about water pressure and backup valves. The tank had gone from villain to celebrity. I even got a letter from a local school asking if they could bring a class by for a field trip. I said yes. Why not? If Karen could spread paranoia like a weed, maybe I could plant something better. One night, while standing on my porch, watching the lights twinkle off the side of the tank, I realized how close this community had come to breaking. Not from natural disaster, but from the slow erosion of trust. Karen had built her kingdom on control, isolation, and fear of the unfamiliar. But in the end, the thing she tried to remove was the very thing that brought people together. That tank didn't just fight fire. It exposed what was rotten and helped clear the way for something stronger. And yet, even with all that resolved, I kept the original permit binder close. I kept the footage, the city correspondence, and every HOA newsletter that mentioned the tank. Not out of paranoia, but principle. I knew that someone, somewhere, would try something again. Maybe not Karen, but her spirit wasn't unique. There would always be another bureaucrat obsessed with aesthetics over safety, another self-appointed enforcer who thought control mattered more than community. And when that day came, I'd be ready. As fall approached, I made one small change to the tank. With the help of a welder friend, I installed a new sign above the water valves. It was simple, made of steel, etched with bold letters. It read, "Function over fiction." Below it, in smaller print, was the emergency contact number for Station 14 and a QR code to the fire safety plan. It didn't need to be flashy. It didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to work. Just like the tank. Just like the truth. In the end, the fire was never the enemy. The real danger was forgetting why things are built the way they are. Why rules exist, and why they should never be twisted into weapons by the wrong hand. The tank didn't just carry water. It carried a message. That preparation matters. That common sense beats control. And that sometimes the most important battles happen long before the flames arrive. Karen never walked past my house again. But I didn't need her to. Because every time someone thanked me, every time a kid asked a question, every time a fire truck passed and gave a quick honk of appreciation, I knew the story had already been rewritten. And this time, it wasn't hers to tell.